Good morning. I want to begin by thanking the Working Group of Collections Management of the Brazilian Archaeology Society and the Network of Museums and Archaeological Collections for inviting me to speak to you today. It's an honor to be able to share my thoughts, which I have accumulated over more than 25 years. The focus of my talk is on the lessons we are learning in the United States about how to make archaeological collections management sustainable, which I understand is also important in Brazil. For decades, the U.S., as in many countries, have had inadequate funding, staff, and space for collections. So now we must ask, how do we invest in the present to ensure continued preservation, care, and access to collections in the future? I have two goals. The first is to identify the principal factors that are critical to making archaeological collections management sustainable. The second is to present how those factors can be used to realize sustainability. Sustainability will not be achieved quickly and/or easily. Not all factors have to be dealt with simultaneously. And importantly, progress in one factor can influence progress in another area. Before I begin, I want to be clear on how I define two words. First, an archaeological collection consists of all the artifacts, samples such as soil, and associated records, both hard copy and digital, from an archaeological project. Sometimes no artifacts are collected during a project, but records, data, and a report are always created, and all of these must be preserved. I also refer to a repository, which is a museum, cultural or archaeological center, laboratory, or other facility that provides professional curatorial services. In the U.S., we have identified at least 12 different types of repositories, as seen here. I understand Brazil has different types of repositories too, which certainly differ in various ways and can learn from each other. There's 7 factors that I believe must be considered and integrated to achieve sustainability in managing archaeological collections, as you see here. I quickly discuss each to provide some context in which to consider how to make collections management sustainable in the second part of this talk. Stakeholders, as you know, are the people who have some relationship with collections and repositories, whether they know it or not. This slide shows the wide range of these people in the U.S., besides the curators, registrars, conservators, and other repository staff. Although I put them in columns of those that are impacted by and impact collections, there's often crossover between the two groups, especially those in the first list. For example, indigenous communities are impacted by objects that they can use to revitalize their cultural practices or to learn about their history. At the same time, indigenous communities can have impact on collections through direct involvement in the interpretation and care of curated objects and in the design and content of exhibits and public programs. I don't have time to discuss most of these stakeholders, but I do want to point out a couple of groups in the list who impact collections. The administrators of institutions such as universities or large multidisciplinary museums, the managers of development companies, politicians, and government agency managers. They can all have direct influence on the support that goes to curating collections and operating repositories. All stakeholders need to know the values and benefits of archaeological collections, so let's quickly look at what these are. Again, I don't have time to talk about each of these, but I do want to point out several things. First, a collection of objects has value only when it includes all the records and data from the investigation, lab work, and analyses. Without the records to provide context, there's little reason to curate the objects unless exceedingly rare. Second, archaeological collections are not static or stagnant and cannot be stored away and never seen again. As new knowledge is learned about them, their value and significance increases. However, that only happens if the objects and records are accessible to researchers, descendant communities, teachers, students, and the public. Finally, The benefits of collections come alive at repositories where education, connecting to indigenous people's past, research opportunities, resource management, and more occur in active and dynamic ways. Sustainability of collections and repositories can only occur if all stakeholders, especially archaeologists, know the many stages of collections management from the field to the repository. This slide shows a diagram that my colleague Danielle Bendon and I recently published with these management stages. The first four, as highlighted, are the responsibilities of archaeologists working with other stakeholders. The many problems regarding collections stem from these four stages, since many archaeologists are not taught about their duties to the collections they create. The heritage management laws that many countries have provide a foundation upon which archaeological investigations and collections care are supported. Like Brazil, the U.S. has had such laws since the 1960s. Our curation crisis developed since so many collections were created under the laws. As seen here, U.S. federal regulations were enacted in 1990 for the curation of federally owned collections that provide standards for the care of and access to collections. Also, the archaeological and museum professions have standards and ethics that influence the long-term preservation of archaeological collections. Stewardship and preservation for the future of both sites and collections are currently fundamental to the ethics of the U.S. archaeological community, and I suspect in Brazil too. A very serious consideration in achieving sustainable collections management, especially if repositories have limited storage space, funding, and staff, is the time frame involved. Most curators and archaeologists have believed that collections should be managed and preserved in perpetuity or forever. In U.S. federal regulation, the designated time frame is long-term, but it's not defined. Do all collections or all parts of all collections need to be curated forever? Do they all have long-term potential for research, education, and heritage uses by indigenous communities? Should collections continue to be preserved if they've never been accessed and used? And does it make more sense to preserve records forever, but not objects, since digital records take up little physical storage space? These are questions that need to be pondered. Every collections management stage has costs that must be understood to achieve sustainability. The principal costs involve personnel, materials, equipment, and technology, like computer hardware and software, and all of these vary in importance by stage. In general, preparation and execution of an archaeological project involve one-time costs, while collections management in a repository involves recurring or episodic costs. Key questions are, what are those costs and who pays for them at each management stage? And here are some of the costs from the field to the repository. Clearly, it's not possible to be sustainable if there are not reliable sources of funding to support collections management. When I showed you the many stakeholders who are related to collections in some way, those who impact collections are potential decision makers who can influence whether an archaeologist or a repository will get the support, usually funding or even legal actions or policy actions it requires to do their job. Okay, so now I will quickly re-examine each factor to highlight what can be done, perhaps revolutionize, to improve the chances that sustainability can be realized. Note that there can be overlap between the factors, such as the impacts of the stakeholders, costs, and funding sources on the stages of collections management. But these overlaps may help to identify what actions to focus on first. Sustainability can only happen if stakeholders are fully engaged, and as soon as possible. Below, I mentioned different stakeholders when they are necessary for actions and the other factors to achieve sustainability. The most important thing to do in terms of stakeholders is to know who they are and how they relate to collections and repositories. Remember, many probably don't recognize themselves as important to or involved in collections. Again, politicians and managers and government agencies and development companies can influence funding decisions and must be constantly educated about collections, or support can dwindle, go away, or never start. I gave you a list of stakeholders that are important in the US, but there might be others in Brazil that need to be recognized. When you know who they are, engage with them regularly, and provide information and statistics on your accomplishments. Other stakeholders that must be engaged with are archaeologists and academia. It's critical that they teach graduate students about collections management from the field to the repository, including how to budget for collections and project planning, collections preparation, and working with indigenous communities on collections. Academics need to use existing collections in their teaching and even consider requiring collections-based research for master's degrees. Many of our problems in the U.S. stem from a lack of education about archaeologists' responsibilities to the collections they recover. The most important thing to do related to the values and benefits of collections and repositories is to make sure all stakeholders know them. I gave you a list of those values and benefits we have identified in the U.S., but there may be others pertinent in Brazil. It's also important to ask why we preserve collections if they are not accessible to users. This means that the collections need to be cataloged and findable in a repository, and potential users must be able to find out what collections each repository curates, such as on a repository's website. One possible way to facilitate this communication is through a group of archaeological repositories. I'm really thrilled to learn that Brazil has a network of museums and archaeological collections, which I really want to learn more about. We are trying to establish such a group, given all the repository types in the U.S., due to their need to network, learn about successful best practices, and develop a national database to identify what collections they curate. So there are a number of actions that often need to be instituted at various stages of collections management in order to achieve sustainability. I can only talk about the key ones based on my experience and observations. I can emphasize the communication between archaeologists and repository staff is useful at every stage. During project planning, archaeologists must budget for the collections recovered and analyzed in the field, and for long-term curation in the repository. This must include funding for the preserving the records and data produced as well. When a license is required for the project, it must identify where the collection will be curated and require evidence of a curation agreement between the archaeologist and a repository. Also, no new archaeological project should be funded without provisions for the long-term curation of the resulting collection. This means that granting institutions, developers, and government agencies must know their responsibilities to the collections created by their funding instruments. At the curation preparation stage, repositories must have a scope of collections to identify what they will and will not accept, and a collection acceptance policy that informs archaeologists how they should prepare the collection for the repository, such as the type of bags and boxes to use, how to label artifacts, and standards for digital records. At the collection acceptance stage, it's reasonable that the repositories charge a fee for long-term curation. This fee must be budgeted for by the archaeologist, and the funding institution must cover it. If not, the repository will have to depend on other funding sources to curate the collection, which is rarely sustainable. At the access and use stage, repositories must inform researchers, indigenous communities, the public, and other stakeholders about the collections they curate, including posting their collections catalogs on the internet, creating physical and online exhibits, and using social media to communicate. Collaborating with indigenous communities on exhibits, interpretation, Object handling and intellectual property issues is critical. Graduate students should be required to conduct a collections-based project which will increase their understanding and appreciation of archaeological collections and maximize the research and heritage potentials of collections. Now, the last stage, deaccessioning of archaeological artifacts, I really think should be permitted, albeit carefully. Deaccessioning is often avoided because of the stewardship ethic in archaeology and the idea that all collections are irreplaceable. If repositories have a good accessioning policy and scope of collections, then there should be little need to deaccession. However, over time, considerable redundancy in collections can occur. Objects lose their physical integrity, or the provenience of a collection becomes unknown due to lack or loss of field records. The number of times a collection was used must also be considered. Such difficult decision-making and work will yield several benefits, though. First, the costs of maintaining existing collections, such as reboxing, will only be applied to those that justify improvement. And second, storage space will be freed up for new collections. I can't comment on the heritage laws in Brazil since I don't know them. I can recommend that there should be laws and regulations or policies that provide uniform standards for the preservation of and access to archaeological collections, which I understand Brazil now has. We have found that it is important that penalties are stipulated for those who don't comply, though. Deadlines for such actions is when archaeologists must submit a collection to a repository and when repositories must achieve specific curation standards are necessary. Also, archaeologists should be required to report where their collections are curated in all publications and reports so they can be found by future users. I think the most important standards right now that must be developed and or revised over time are those for the long-term curation of digital records and data. Because of the increasing amount of digital information being created and also the rapidness of technological change, standards must include the appropriate methods to migrate materials to appropriate hardware and software over time and how to ensure their findability. Additionally, technical and procedural standards for repository acceptance of digital records are essential, including metadata standards. I also recommend developing guidelines to manage the growth of archaeological collections. The location and types of archaeological sites are systematically recorded in Brazil, but are the collections? Information about sites and collections should be used together to develop regional plans to identify where the gaps in the archaeological record are, to encourage new projects where the gaps exist, and so archaeologists know where to review existing collections as they prepare a new project. The preservation timeframe for archaeological collections must be evaluated and clearly defined by archaeologists, indigenous communities, and repository staff working together. Once it's decided if collections will be curated forever or not, it's critical to develop decision-making methods for periodic evaluation of what should be kept or not. Significance criteria have been developed in Australia, the US, and England. Such criteria involve the collection itself, including research and heritage use potential, the site from which the collection was recovered, and how the collection was managed, including number of uses, condition, and the quality of the field records and data. Such evaluation would need to be done on a schedule with trigger dates tied to collection management decisions. Then, if a collection has medium to high significance, the evaluators would decide on a course of continued maintenance, along with a funding plan. If the collection has low significance and was never used, the evaluators would decide on a course of removal, such as deaccessioning. So many of the actions suggested above to achieve sustainability do involve costs. Don't forget that the amount of staff time it takes to do a particular action, such as deaccessioning a portion of a collection is part of those costs. Another important matter related to costs involves whether repositories charge curation fees. Many U.S. repositories began charging fees for curation from archaeologists, government agencies, or developers, whichever is appropriate, because they couldn't afford to curate collections without additional funding support. The determination of appropriate fees is complicated, though. Based on complaints I hear in the U.S., I also recommend that there's an attempt to standardize curation fees at repositories so that archaeologists can better predict and budget for collections. Such standardization could be done by your network that considers regional or state-based variation in repository costs, which I'm sure there are. The final factor to achieving sustainable collections management is funding sources. In the interest of time, I'll focus on 3 recommendations. First, all granting institutions that fund archaeological fieldwork must require the following in a grant proposal. First, identification of the repository to curate the collections. Second, submission of a repository agreement that states the responsibilities of both parties. And 3, a collections budget. Grantors can then use this information to assess the validity of the project and then fund what is reasonable, including collections. These requirements ensure that the collection created will be curated and available for future uses. Second, we've learned in the U.S. that when possible, fee assessing repositories benefit from having an endowment fund. They put a portion of the curation fee income into an interest-bearing account to pay for future collections work, although we have found that sometimes creating endowments is prevented due to existing law. Third, a number of community-oriented repositories have benefited from monetary donations from the public to help with becoming sustainable. Repository staff work hard to engage their public by providing traveling exhibits, teaching kits for schools, and programs for descendant communities and others. Many repositories have advisory boards with community members on them, and the enthusiasm of those members inspire community involvement, whether through volunteer work or financial donations. So in conclusion, I hope my framework for paths to collection sustainability are helpful and not totally duplicative of what you're already doing. I do have other recommendations that I didn't have time to talk about. There are a number of publications, a few shown here, that provide useful details on how to achieve many of these suggestions. Key to making any of this happen, however, is to break down the long-held separation of fieldwork from repository work and recognize the continuum of responsibilities by archaeologists, curators, and many others. If stakeholders work together, especially archaeologists and repository staff, there's a chance that some significant inroads can be made towards achieving sustainable collections management from the field to the repository. Thank you.